Welcome, everyone, to this briefing brought to you by the Israel Defense and Security Forum, IDSF. We continue to bring you from the front lines in Israel what is happening in this war. And certainly, as there's just so much happening right now with Iran, we're trying very hard to follow everything and to bring it straight to you. And as I've mentioned over the past few days, we've been sending out emails through our email program, really with updates and understanding of what's happening in this war. So if you're not receiving our emails, make sure to sign up so that in addition to these briefings, you can really stay up to date. It's a great pleasure to be joined today by the Director of International Government Relations, Elie Pierpz. Elie, thank you so much for joining the briefing today.
Moshe, it's great to see you. I miss Israel. Hopefully we will be reuniting in Israel very soon.
Absolutely. It's very hard. It's very hard to be away from home when all of this is happening. So why don't you give us a little bit of a sense of what it's like right now in Israel and, Jerusalem. Usually throughout this war, Jerusalem, thank God, has been relatively quiet in terms of having to run into the bomb shelters. What is the sense right now? What's the feeling in Jerusalem like?
I would say thank you so much. Yeah, it is. I think the general sense is that it is a privilege to be in Israel at this time. There is a real sense that we are living through historic moments for the world nowadays, but also historic moments for the Jewish people. I think in the bomb shelter, I live in one of the oldest communities built just outside of the old city walls, a neighborhood called Yamin Moshe. You might be familiar with, there's a big windmill just outside of the old city. So our homes were built in the 1870s, 1880s. Clearly, we did not have a modern mamad, a modern bomb shelter. So we have community bomb shelters. So as a result, when you run outside a few doors away and you run to a bomb shelter, you end up with a lot of neighbors. Some neighbors are religious. Some neighbors are not religious. Some are actually our tourists who are here. Yet everybody feels, obviously there is a certain fear, and everybody reacts to the moment when you hear the booms slightly differently. Some people shriek. Some people are excited. Some people, are being distracted from what they're reading on their cell phone. Yet overall there is a real sense that there is something momentous. We're observing it. It'll be something that we will talk about for a long time because there is a sense of achdut, there's a sense of unity, the sense of purpose, and that we didn't choose this moment, but we are now put into it, and we now need to make the best of it. I would say moving forward, the one concern that I have in Jerusalem is that people might, at some point, stop taking some of these the alarms and the alerts seriously enough. Unfortunately, we have seen enough missiles that hit that cause huge damage. That hopefully that won't happen. But because really none of the missiles are really, besides maybe one, have not been aimed at Jerusalem, have been gone to other parts of the country. My concern is that some of my neighbors in Jerusalem will not take it quite as seriously, and then there might be a tragedy. But other than that, my overall sense is a sense of camaraderie, a sense of let's get this over fast. We're grateful how well the IDF and the war seems to be going, and we're hoping that it will continue.
For sure. And I think you were on a live TV interview when an alarm went off.
Yeah.
And I'm curious, on the other end in the studio, when they were watching and hearing, what was their reaction?
It was actually quite funny. I'm actually have my phone with me. Normally, I try to keep my phone away from me when I'm doing these interviews. Now you have to have your phone right next to you. And I was, unbeknownst to me, I was doing a live interview in India and on a panel with an Iranian, which I was not familiar with. I didn't realize that was going to be the case. And he said the most outrageous things the entire time. It was really hard to fathom how you could be that creative and make up. And I almost felt sorry that he had a narrative that was so disconnected from reality. But at the end, I had a minute to sum up, and I got about 30 seconds through when the alarm went off, and I just sort of left and sort of belted out to know now you're shooting missiles at me. And it ended right away. I did see, he left a smirk on his face, but the Indian host, who consistently actually was extremely sympathetic. There was a moment where the Iranian guy said, there's no way that the Iranian regime is actually creating nuclear weapons because it is, he said, haram, it's asur, it is illegal under Muslim law to create a weapon of mass destruction. And before I could even gather myself to respond, the host, who's Indian, says, we are adjacent to a country called Pakistan. Pakistan is officially a Muslim nation. They are very public that they have a nuclear weapon. And the guy stammered a little bit, but it was one thing after another. And I think when it ended and I had to run off, the journalist, the other Indian general who was on the air were extremely sympathetic. Obviously, the Iranian was not. But I think overall there is a broad sense, and this is probably actually a perfect segue. There's a broad sense of unity. Countries that just days ago were threatening Israel, were challenging Israel in many ways. Their actions have actually belied them and how much they are supporting Israel, because everybody knows that Iran is a threat. Everybody knows. We expected that actually 2 days ago, France was going to be a country that was going to try to create, try to recognize a Palestinian state at this exact moment. And we were working against them, trying to stop it diplomatically. There were challenges to that, and fortunately, Israel's diplomatic corps and plus organizations like IDSF acted, and I think we were looking. It looked like France was going to be climbing down that ladder. However, now, while France is not our biggest ally, they certainly have expressed support for what we're doing. England, which a couple of weeks ago was sanctioning some of our ministers in the government, are bringing weapons into the region right away. They're bringing an Air Force carrier. Jordan, a country who their leadership just a couple of days ago was saying things, speaking really horrifically about Israel, a country that they're at peace with, has been shooting down drones over their territory. Now, they're afraid to acknowledge to their population that they were protecting Israel, so they say these were drones that were threatening Jordanian civilians, violating Jordanian airspace. But the reality is, this was something that is benefiting Israel, and they all understand that Iran is a problem. That takes us to the U.S. There was, and I think when we think about the Americas, President Trump's and the Trump administration's reaction, their engagement, what they're going to do, what they're not going to do, how they have been behaving themselves regarding Israel. I think the best way that I think to approach it is to go back to the beginning before the war and just remember all of the concerns, all of the thoughts about, does the U.S. and Israel have a good relationship or not? There was real concerns and real arguments that Netanyahu had messed up this perfect situation, this perfect storm, that against Netanyahu's will and his interest, Trump went and decided to do negotiations with Iran. Hey, it's the same thing as Obama. And people were saying, how did this happen? This was like a perfect situation for Israel. How did this happen? Something must have gone wrong. And I think this was actually a very common refrain you heard, not surprisingly, from political opponents of Netanyahu in Israel. But you also started hearing this in many other places. What was going on? It seemed like the U.S. was heading towards an agreement that was going to handcuff Israel. What was Israel going to do? Was Israel going to oppose it? Was Israel just going to take it? How was Israel going to? And the entire time this is going on, those were certainly some of the messaging and some of the actions that were coming out of DC could have led someone to believe that. On the other hand, there was also the other actions which were discounted. And I think it's really valuable to sort of look at that when you see the level of constant communication between Netanyahu, between Ron Dermer, between Israel's ambassador, Israel's ambassador to America, Ambassador Dr. Yechiel Leiter, and others who were constantly back and forth. They were the ones, those people, those Israeli officials, were never expressing any fear. They never acted in any kind of despair. There was a never sense that things were getting out of control. The only people who were saying that were people who actually didn't have access, and all they had access to was specific comments made or leaked to the press. Now, it's important to understand, particularly with the Trump administration, when you are seeing comments that are leaked to the Washington Post, understand that they are trying to send a message to a certain audience. If President Trump wants to communicate a very vital and a critical message for the Trump administration, for what President Trump believes in, he's not calling up the local reporter from the Washington Post and saying, hey, I've got a scoop for you. The same thing with the Israeli reporter by the name of Barak Ravid from Axios. That is not something that President Trump is going to be doing if he wants to communicate something. Yet, consistently throughout the last few months, the people who were reporting, or the media entities that were reporting that things were sideways between Trump and Netanyahu, that Netanyahu was persona non grata, he had messed this whole thing up. I even heard less than a week, actually it was right after Shavuot, I even heard that people were thinking that Ron Dermer was also not allowed into the White House anymore and that he was persona non grata. This was all being whispered by people who had reasons to do so, largely people with political grinds here in Israel. And unfortunately, that continues to be something that we see, and it's something that is actually quite toxic. The reality couldn't have been any further from the truth. The coordination was at its highest levels. Yet, again, we're at this point a week later after viewing the amount of deception and the amount of, on the one hand, deception externally, and the amount of cooperation internally between America and Israel at the highest levels. It's hard even to fathom the level of how coordinated they were and how this was planned. I think you all know that President Trump spoke about 60 days of negotiations, and this happened on day 61. How it seemed like the President Trump may have said something that Israel was concerned just hours before the attack that may have tipped off the Iranians, and Israelis were able to encourage President Trump to put out yet another tweet covering his tracks that there will be no. This was a sense that we're all on the same page. We're all trying to get to the same result. We each have our different ways of doing it, but we are all focused and reading from the same script. Yet, a week later, we're back here at this point where people are saying, oh no, Trump is going to undermine Israel. Trump is, he's got a different mindset. He doesn't really want this. He's going to listen to Tucker Carlson. And obviously, I think he may have put that to bed with his tweet against Tucker Carlson. However, what remains to be seen, and I think this is what's key, Israel acts on what's best for Israel. America acts on what's best for America. I think the reasons why America and Israel are involved or are going to get involved at different levels in this conflict is because of how it affects their own countries, which means they are different reasons. The fact that they are different regions doesn't mean that they are not strong allies. They are not totally working together and want to get the same result. But I think that is when you approach this, when you look at this, I think when you look at it through that prism, it makes it much easier, I think, to see reality and not get confused by, I think, a lot of misinformation that comes from the media that wants to be a little bit more active. And just for a second, if I can just go off on the media, I think that is something that I think is really critical and it's vital. There was a time when media actually did their job, when media was out there acting as real journalists, trying to find information, something that other people didn't have access to. Now, most of the media, they go to public statements, get information from public spokesmen, and then just regurgitate it. It's not much more than when you're a journalist and you're a weatherman. Okay, yes, weathermen can read the Doppler maybe better than you and I can, But the reality is they're just sharing information that almost everybody else has access to. Most of us just don't want to go ahead and watch the White House press briefings. But if we got the White House press briefings, we could write the same articles. What's missing is journalists who aren't taking what public officials are saying publicly, what their spokesmen are saying publicly. You aren't finding, obviously there are exceptions, and I'm speaking generally, but I think that is something that's missing. And I think when you choose a question that I get, and I'm sure Moshe you get, and almost everybody from IDSF gets, is where can we get reliable information? Obviously, this podcast is one of its webinar is one of the best places to get it. And as Moshe, you've done a phenomenal job maintaining this over the last 89 weeks of this war. But when people want other information, other media outlets, you really got to choose that carefully, and look at where their sources are coming from, and look at how accurate they are. One of the ways I train myself on this, as I'm a big sports fan, is I always like to listen to podcasts when I want a little break, and I'll listen podcasts about the NFL or American football. And what I find interesting is the games are generally played on Sunday. And I find oftentimes I listen on Monday to what the projections were the previous on Friday, what people were projecting the games to be. Now I know what the results are going to be. You could see how inaccurate people are in their projections. The same thing can be done in politics. Sometimes you look and see what people's projections, how wrong they are. There's very little accountability. When's the last time a journalist had predicted X and Y happened and he lost their job? That doesn't happen. There's no accountability. The motivation is to get headlines. And the biggest headline is that Israel and the US are not on the same page. And so I think anytime you hear that for the near future, look at what's happened over the last few months. Understand that things did not just blow up. This is not a repeat of Trump and Elon Musk. This is months and months working together. This is months and months. And I think now let's get to why has the US been involved at the level that it has been? And why should that give us confidence that the US will probably continue to see this conflict through the exact same eyes as we move forward? Why? Why did the US see it this way? Why has the US been involved? It's because President Trump sees removing nuclear weapons from Iran as a US interest. The fact that it's also an Israeli interest is gravy, is wonderful. That allows Israel to do the hard work. Israel's taking all the risk. Israel is taking all the risk of our fighters, of our home front. The US gets to sit here and watch. And frankly, that is to a certain extent how allies work together. The US provides a tremendous amount of diplomatic cover. The US has been providing a lot of weapons, has been saying everything properly, has been preventing other diplomatic challenges that we may have seen. And I think there's obviously many other things that we are not privy to, that it's clear that the US is very active and very involved. But let's talk about what are the benefits to the US, other than what President Trump has spoken about, the removal of Iran as a nuclear capable country. It's also reestablishing the US as an effective diplomatic negotiator. Now you could say, oh, that sounds a little bit odd. Didn't diplomacy just fail? Isn't the fact that we're at war an indictment on American diplomacy? There were supposed to be negotiations on Sunday, and instead we were receiving missiles. It would seem like that negotiations failed, and the answer is no. Negotiations actually didn't fail. The only time negotiations can be successful is if there is a credible military option that's on the table. And for so long, while people talk about that, particularly in previous American administrations, always spoke about having negotiations with a credible military option on the table, but nobody really believed it because everybody understood that the goal, they were petrified to have wars, they were petrified to actually use that force and refused to do it. In President Trump's previous administration, he knocked off Soleimani, something that he didn't need to negotiate on. He has demonstrated time and time again his understanding of the critical nature of this conflict as an American interest. It's very hard to argue that Israel talked the U.S. into attacking and killing Soleimani. This is something that the U.S. decided and the U.S. did. Would have gotten a lot more coverage had a week later the COVID not broken out. But at the time, even when Trump did that, it was, I believe it was like January 1st or January 2nd, 2020. The screams from much of the media in the U.S. was that World War III is about the end. Here, President Trump worked together with Israel, took the military option off the table, started exercising it, and that is now makes every single future diplomatic negotiation that the U.S. engaged in during Trump's administration, whether it's led by Witkoff, whether it's led by Marco Rubio, whether it's led by any other American official, it made it that much more effective, that much more credible. I would actually argue that pretty soon you might see a tweet that says, "Making American diplomacy great again." He has reestablished after President Obama violated the red line that he set with Syria years ago, and I think American diplomacy from that moment on, their word was meaningless. They knew it was meaningless. It was a lot of talk. It was empty talk. Now, I think you see American diplomacy is going to be a much stronger, much more effective, and it is due specifically to the fact that this didn't result in a deal. President Trump understood. He said 60 days. That meant 60 days, not 61, not 62, 60. And if not, there's a credible military threat available, and it's being utilized, not by American troops. I think that was also a very smart strategic move by President Trump to work with Israel, a willing and able partner and capable partner. So I think that's key. Another point that I want to make is a point that Amir Avivi has said numerous times in our meetings that we've had with the U.S. administration. I'll say this goes back to the Biden administration. When talking about the importance and the necessity of America being involved in this war, it wasn't just to stop Iran. It was to send a very clear message to the other major powers that are a threat to world stability and, frankly, a threat to American interests. We're talking about China, and we're talking about Russia. And one of the arguments that Amir made very convincingly and very effectively is that, you have these three. North Korea is not at that level, but you have these three powers that are destabilizing forces within the world. And they are threats to the United States of America, and there was really no disagreement. Republican, Democrats, there's broad disagreement. All three of those, to varying degrees, are threats, are adversaries to some extent. They may not be enemies, but they definitely see them not on the same page. And all of them have aggressive activities, aggressive mentalities, and have been a destabilizing force in the world. And that has tremendous impact on the U.S., tremendous impact on the world economy, and that there is a vested interest in the U.S. in preventing that. Now, how do you prevent that? Well, you could try to challenge China directly. That's, while the U.S. ultimately would be successful, it would be very, very costly, both for the Chinese and the Americans. Same thing, you could do the exact same thing with Russia. The easiest and the most vulnerable member of that axis to confront, and could confront it very effectively, is Iran. And when Israel has done this for the U.S., together with the U.S., it has sent a very, very powerful message to Russia and China that we're not talking, that President Trump does not, it seems like President Trump does not want to use troops, does not want to get American troops involved. However, at the end of the day, his interest is in protecting the interests of the United States of America. And if necessary, military force is possible. And it's something that he's not afraid to do, whether it's his own troops, whether it's with allies, but that's part of it. And that needs to be part of the calculation that was not necessarily part of the calculation of Russia and China a week ago. Now, I guarantee both Russia and China understand that any confrontation with the U.S., a military confrontation, is now much more possible than they otherwise would have thought. I'll say on top of that, just small things like anyone else. President Trump likes winners. And as any any ally, I mean, we were not particularly on October 7th and October 8th. We were not a particularly Israel was not a particularly strong and attractive ally to Saudi Arabia and to all of the potential new partners of the Abraham Accords because we were losing, because we were weak. How valuable of an ally is Israel to these countries if we can't even handle Hamas? Well, 89 weeks later, there's a very different dynamic. Israel has emerged. Israel has responded effectively against Hamas. Still not done there, but they are no longer the threat they were. We have effectively decapitated Hezbollah. We have also put the hurt on the Houthis. And now we've also, I would say, largely humiliated Iran as well. Now we are a very effective partner. We were able to demonstrate that to President Trump. And therefore, I think, it makes sense that Trump views Israel as a very effective and strong ally, one that I think will have repercussions beyond just this immediate conflict. And then I'll say something else. One other idea that I think President Trump really violates, which is this idea of there's a sense in modern diplomacy that you're supposed to keep people, make sure that every other country knows exactly what we want to do. This is a relic from the Cold War, where America and the Soviet Union understood that we don't want to say anything that might be misconstrued, that might lead to World War III by just pressing buttons. And since then, this idea that we want to communicate very clearly, very effectively, so that our enemies understand exactly what we want to do. Is that how Israel enemies act? No, Israel's enemies say one thing publicly to an international audience, another thing to their own audience. They try to be very confusing, and they don't speak directly. I think President Trump takes a page right out of that approach. Frankly, it's an approach that Israel does as well. We want to keep people guessing. We do not want our enemies to have a good sense of what we want to do. That's how you try to control them. That's how you try to get what you want. We don't announce when we are going to attack. We make it clear that you better behave, and if you don't follow what we want, then that attack is an option. And I think Israel has done that effectively in this war. I think the U.S. has done that effectively in aligning with Israel and empowering Israel and encouraging Israel and its actions. And I do expect that this will continue. And I see no reason to believe that this will not continue for the foreseeable future.
Elie Pierpz, I have so many questions for you, but we are completely and totally out of time. So I will look forward to asking you all of my questions from the other side of the ocean. We'll get you back on the briefing. We will continue this very important discussion. So thank you so much for joining. Thank you for sharing all of that. Thank you to all of our viewers and supporters for tuning into this briefing. We will be back with you next week, 10 a.m. Eastern Time on Monday, 5 p.m. in Israel. Until then, stay safe, stay strong. Take care, everyone.